Thank you. Cynthia Slater.
Good afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for holding this session and inviting me or giving me the opportunity to speak to this commission. My name is Cynthia Slater, and I serve as Second Vice President of the Florida State Conference NAACP. I also serve as the NAACP Civic Engagement Coordinator for the state of Florida. And I reside in Daytona Beach, so I drove about 4.5 hours to get here to speak to this commission. The NAACP is the oldest and largest civil rights organization in this country, and we have existed for 114 years. Civic engagement is one of the most important initiatives of the NAACP because we believe that every voting age citizen in this country has a right to cast a ballot. That is why after Florida passed HB 1355, the NAACP stood firm and continued to do voter registrations. It was difficult for me to select a topic from the list that you provided because Florida was affected by one way or another by each one of the issues that was presented. However, I would like to comment on the issue of the number and location management and operation of polling places. Let me just begin by quoting a statement from an article written in the Huffington Post dated January 24th, 2013. And it states, and I quote, "At least 201,000 Florida voters did not cast ballots on Election Day 2012 because they were discouraged by long lines at polling places, according to a report released by the Orlando Sentinel." The article went on to say that those voters either waited for some time but left before voting or simply saw the long lines and was turned away. Those words rang true because the state, particularly in African American communities, gave the state of Florida another black eye for suppressing voters in an election. During and after the 2012 presidential election, these words were the headlines of many newspapers throughout the country and were fodder for a late-night TV comedy. Florida voters experienced many problems during the election, but one of the worst, seen by millions, related to long lines at polling sites. And because the state of Florida cut the number of days for early voting and did not consider even increasing the number of polling sites, not only suppressed voters, but it also created an unsafe and dangerous environment, especially to those voters who had physical disabilities, health problems, and age-related problems, as many of the speakers noted earlier. These limitations caused chaos where voters had to wait hours, and in some cities up to 9 hours, to cast ballots in the heat of the day. In addition to the complaints of long lines and limited polling sites, the complaints all included equipment breakdowns or malfunctioning, as well as limited staff in many of the voting sites. So much so that polling sites were temporarily closed in certain Florida counties. And so it is without a doubt that these problems occurred because of HB 1355, which passed early in 2011. And as a result, some of the worst forms of voter suppression occurred here in the state of Florida, limiting the number of days of early voting as well as limiting polling sites. I believe the primary cause of the chaos that happened here in Florida. So the NAACP units throughout the state of Florida worked tirelessly to maintain the election process, make sure that voters were able to cast their ballots. We engaged in citizens with voter registration, voter education, voter participation, and also voter protection. And we recommend that there is an increase in polling site, increase in early voting days, an increase in hours of early voting, and also an increase in poll workers. But I want to, as I close, I want to share with you, with this commission, a tragic story that happened here in Florida in 1951. It may sound like many years ago, but it certainly rings true today. And this tragic story happened in Mims, Florida, in Brevard County. And in 1951, Harry T. Moore was the field secretary for the NAACP, and he was also a teacher. And in 1951, on Christmas night, a bomb was placed under his home while he slept. He and his wife, Harriet T. Moore, slept. Harry T. Moore he registered voters. He fought for equal pay for African Americans back in the days that it was unheard of. The bomb was placed under his home, and on Christmas night, just before midnight, the bomb exploded, killing Harry T. Moore instantly, and killing his wife died on January 1st of the following year. So the NAACP used his, because he was a martyr, he is a martyr of the civil rights movement, and was actually the first NAACPer to die for particularly for the rights of voter registering people to vote. We stood firm on continuing to register people to vote, and we hope that this commission will consider all of the recommendations that these participants and these speakers have addressed to you this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. Bradford Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. It's a pleasure to follow my state chair of political action for the NAACP and civic engagement, as I serve as the first vice president and political action chair of the Miami-Dade branch of the NAACP. And I have my statement up on your, sent to your website, but I will try to briefly summarize it here. I have personally been involved registering and getting out to vote since the early 1960s, and the last time I worked registering to get people out to vote was less than 2 weeks ago here in Miami. Earlier in Miami, when I first came here, it was very difficult. I remember having to be sworn in as a deputy registrar, being required to name the place where we were going to do our registration. We couldn't move from that place. We couldn't do it on Sunday, but we did it. But so obviously, motor voter was a real boon to us. But after the debacle of the 2000 election, we were involved with our national office and partners such as the Advancement Fund in addressing obstacles in voting and registration, as we often found that officers such as motor vehicles were certainly less than enthusiastic in carrying out their new responsibilities. For this past year, as several people have mentioned, the state of Florida placed a number of obstacles in the way of those of us doing third-party voter registration. And as Ms. Slater mentioned, we in the NAACP tried to conform. We registered as third parties, but the number we were registering was very, very small until the various court decisions and others loosened up the rules. At that point, we finally managed to register several thousand people here in Miami and actually entered over 10,000 names of new registered voters we were responsible for in this county in the NAACP voter computer van network program. However, even under those circumstances, there were significant difficulties. If somebody came up to us and maybe they registered and they said, I need to take one for my daughter or my son, we couldn't give them a form because our numbered forms would cost us $50 a form if for some reason they didn't get it back in with it. So even though we had a relief on the 48 hours, we still were faced with those kind of restrictions. The school system in Dade County ran from voter registration. They'd had a very successful effort they'd carried out every year in all of their civics classes. But the teachers were leery after the debacle of one civics teacher being threatened with a fine of $1,000 for registering the students in her classroom. Eventually, we did get them on board with extra effort from the administration, but it was still not as significant as it had been in the past. And certainly schools should not be hampered in registering students. Civics should be a reality in our school system, not something that the state stands in the way of. I fear very much that in Florida we may well see a return to efforts to restrict third-party voting. And as you can see from the numbers I've quoted, third-party registration is extremely important to many in our communities who it is not necessarily as easy for them as other people who have more access to opportunities to register. Now, and I say that because even though the legislature has removed some of the restrictions on early voting, they certainly haven't gone far enough, not as you have certainly heard from a number of the people here this afternoon. So what I would urge you to definitely consider the area of third-party voting is within that broad purview of your charge, because you know, if you're not registered, you don't even get to stand in those long lines, no matter how dedicated you are. You might consider things like same-day registration, which is something the national NAACP supports. But we certainly urge you to seek other solutions and just make the forms less complicated and confusing. Allow third parties to register voters to help individuals fill out their forms any time or place and be able to return those applications to the registrar's office to ensure that the spirit of the motor voter law is kept in place. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Elbert Garcia.
Good afternoon. I'm here as part of a three-person group for the Florida New Majority, which is a civic engagement and civil rights organization here in the state of Florida. I am the group's communications director, but I'm here today not for myself, but for about 92 other Floridians who left voicemail messages at our offices upon the announcement that the president would form this commission. Some as long as a minute or some as long as 30 seconds. They each left messages of both hope but also a frustration of their voter experience here in this Sunshine State. People like Minnie Dorsett, who her husband, her 80-year-old husband and herself, 78 years old, waited 3 hours just to cast a vote here in Miami-Dade. And the repetition of saying, of hearing her voice saying, I would do it again, I would do it again, and I would do it again. But there must be another way. We've compiled these voicemails on several CDs to hand in, and we'll email into the commission so that they can hear these voices in terms of transcribed as well. I want to leave you guys just with the thought of another one of our volunteers who could not vote, Joanne Joseph from North Miami, who is not yet a citizen, but is of Haitian descent and spent her time volunteering to translate the ballots, to translate and provide any kind of assistance during the early election period. And one of the things that she said was that when she thinks back to those days in the fall of 2012, she says there's no reason why I should have seen people as old as 90 years old wait 5 hours or more to vote. There's no reason why I should have to spend hours explaining ballots and that should be simple and clear to read. These long lines not only embarrass our state, but they also embarrass our country. They send a message internationally that we want to discourage turnout. And it gives power to those who say that our votes don't count and that state policies as well as national policies have been designed to discourage voter participation. The truth is that voting is a fundamental right, Joanne Joseph says, and we at Florida New Majority agree with her. It's not just for every Floridian, but for every American, and that to restore faith in our electoral system, we should consider both national and local legislation that makes voting as easy as paying groceries in a supermarket. Thank you.
Thank you. Marlon Hill.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Thank you for joining us here in South Florida and the University of Miami, where we take democracy more than a spectator sport. I'm here before you. I'm a local attorney here in Miami, and I personally voted at precinct 814, but on the day of election, November the 6th, I was a poll watch attorney. All this full disclosure on behalf of the Obama-Biden campaign. I was assigned the responsibility of overseeing over 50 precincts, pretty much south of here of the University of Miami in South Miami-Dade County. I arrived at my first poll, precinct 812, which happens to be my former high school, Miami Southridge Senior High School. Upon arrival at about 5:45 a.m., near 6 a.m., there were about 200 people waiting in line. At 7 a.m., the poll opened. I introduced myself to the precinct supervisor. A peer colleague from the Romney-Ryan campaign arrived later that morning. There are a couple concerns that I witnessed, and I will reserve my comments just for what I witnessed on that day at the poll and subsequently at other polls which I was called to throughout South Miami-Dade County, driving around. At this first poll, I witnessed that several persons, as stated by previous speakers, elderly and disabled persons, not being proactively helped or not knowing how to be helped. Folks in walkers, elderly folks, and irrespective of my affiliation, I was there to help every voter. We have to do more for elderly and disabled voters. We must. At my first poll here at the high school as well, the poll room was only the size of the parameters of this four corners right here, this room, to your, the dais, and it happened to be my former typing class. That's just too small. This was a high school. My graduating class was well over 950 people in my graduating class alone. That's just too small for a polling area. And thank God for the great weather here in South Florida in November, sunshine. God forbid, with the long lines outside, we would definitely have a challenge with people standing outside, heat, the elements. It's just we have to do more to protect the voters. And there was a huge hallway inside the high school that could have been used to accommodate with more chairs for the elderly, disabled, and even the voters that were waiting. On more than one occasion, I witnessed and spoke to voters outside the permissible boundaries who may have been relocated. Let us, the record reflect, we did have a housing crisis in this country. Many people's homes were foreclosed and they had to move. There was a lot of relocation. So they were being redirected at their inconvenience without being offered a provisional ballot, better yet, an actual ballot. In addition, though I recognize the financial constraints, we should also consider providing more on-site supervisory and operational support for precinct supervisors. I drove to Homestead to one poll to address an issue a voter was having at San Martin de Porres Catholic Church. The precinct supervisor appeared so tired, so worn out, so agitated that he could not deliver the responsiveness and customer service that was expected for special requests from the voters, including an elderly voter that was trying to make her way with her walker where there was not enough access for her to get inside to find a chair, if there was one. He definitely needed some help to recharge and get his customer service face back on. Another obstacle that I witnessed throughout the process is many folks, the constitutional amendments were just unbearable, unbearably too long, just too long. You could see the confusion and the fatigue on the voters' faces. I heard the comments from the supervisors this morning on your very comfortably online stream, and just we need to do more in shortening the ballot. Lastly, I need not implore you that you also need to provide some direction on the streamlining on the process of absentee ballot requests, who can request, how to make the request, when and who can turn them in. FedEx and UPS can do it to track our mail. Why can't we? I left my last poll in Kendall, West Sunset Fire Station, I don't remember the number, on or about 1:30 a.m., well beyond the closure of the polls. In fact, I think my last voter was a judge. This is a clear indication of our lack of capacity and hindrances in the process of our election administration. Members of the Commission, we must work together to provide greater equity, synchronicity, and support for election administration across the state and across the country. Let us try to continue to restore the 14 days or similar periods for early voting. Allow residents who have relocated to in-state to cast an actual, not provisional ballots. Recommit to putting 75-word summaries of constitutional amendments on the ballot here in the state of Florida. And please, provide more capacity and accommodations for elderly and disabled persons. This is America. The last time I checked, it was the United States of America, where all voices stand on the equal ground of this sacred space for the right to vote and to be heard. No person, absolutely no eligible and qualified person, should be impeded or inconvenienced in any way to exercise this right. Let us use the breadth of our financial and legislative power to protect this sacred cornerstone of our democracy. The integrity of the voting process and experience is not a partisan issue, as explained by many of the speakers before me. We want a more consistent and voluminous turnout from all voters, not less. Our union is more stronger with greater civic engagement. I thank you for your leadership and your time. Please come back and see us again.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. You are our last person to give us information for today. We thank you all very much for your comments and for what you've provided to the commission. Yes? I'm sorry? Great. Sorry, we're not done. We'll save the eloquent speech for later.
Good afternoon. I'd like to first thank the members of this commission for holding this
Would you
meeting.
mind identifying yourself, telling us your name?
I'm sorry, my name is Sonia Gibson,
Thank you.
and I'm a leader member of Florida New Majority and an educator for 9 years from Palm Beach County. I'm here today to share my experience as a voter in Palm Beach County. After 2 days of standing in lines in 2 different places, I eventually cast my vote at the Westgate location. It was there that I had the opportunity to witness voters waiting in lines to exercise their constitutional rights in some of the most incorrigible circumstances since I began voting. My personal accounts are of people, young and old, standing in long lines for as long as 8 hours, only to be turned away and deprived of their voting rights. Things like Marcia L. Williams, maybe the lowercase L, looked like a uppercase I, and they were being turned away. I was one of those people, along with my 3 daughters, which stood in line for a total of 19 hours between 2 days, just for the opportunity to exercise what I believe to be a fundamental right. I shared the same frustrations with other voters about registration statuses. I shared the same frustrations with other voters concerning how to fill out ballots. I even shared the same frustrated reactions to overcrowded precincts and closed precincts. The only difference is I did not leave like so many other voters did all over the county. The sad thing is that as far as I can remember, voting has always been an issue here in Palm Beach County, but the reality is it shouldn't be. Democracy is like driving a car. You don't really know all the components or the key players that it takes to make the car start until the day that it doesn't start. Why? Because we expect that car to start. Well, voting is one of the key components to our democracy. In fact, it's like the engine. If we don't protect or secure that engine, how can we expect to run our democracy? That is why I joined so many in pushing for election reform here in Florida. Voting needs to be enshrined permanently into the law so that politicians can't change its dynamics whenever they wish. Voting should be accessible, meaning the operating hours should take into account the diverse schedules that orchestrate people's lives. We want to ensure that Floridians are no longer prevented from voting due to errors or ineffective policies, so that Florida can serve as an example to the rest of the country and celebrate our Constitution and our democracy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. My name is Gihan Pereira, and I'm the Executive Director of Florida New Majority and Florida New Majority Education Fund. I'm proud to be here with Ms. Gibson, as well as all the other community members who've turned out from throughout Florida to give you our testimonies. I would like to remind the Commission, first thank the Commission for allowing us this opportunity to share our experiences and perspectives, and to remind you that you're sitting today just north, miles south from here is the Church of the Good Samaritan, where voters were still standing in line when President Obama accepted his victory for his second term. We are just as about south, just 10 miles from here north, is the North Miami Public Library, where Dessalines Victor, the 102-year-old Haitian farm worker who became a citizen, had to wait in hours in order to vote. I say that because I both want to recognize that you came to Miami and to Florida for a reason, and we hope that you take away a very important lesson from what you learn here. I will echo what a number of other folks have said, but to say that our experience has been in reaching out to minority, low-income, Black, Latino, Haitian, young voters, those who don't usually participate. We talked to 250,000 voters face-to-face last year to encourage them to vote. We and our partners registered over 20,000 voters in the state, and we worked with partners everywhere to try and educate voters, especially about the new rules here in Florida. We helped because we had to here in Florida. We helped train bilingual volunteers to help at the polls for Creole and Spanish assistance, and by many measures, our efforts were successful. Nearly 76% of the people we talked to turned out to vote, and it was an amazing effort across the state by many, many people, many in this room, to really stand up and mobilize the voters in Florida. But that effort wasn't just about efforts of organizations. The effort, more than anything, was about the will and determination of voters in Florida to actually stand up and not only vote their choice, but voting last year was an act of protest against the rash and rush of voter suppression laws, particularly HB 1355 that was unleashed here. As many, and will note, the institutional obstacles put place in Florida included severe restrictions on voter registration by community organizations, a reduction of early voting days, and new rules on voting across counties where many people had been displaced because of the foreclosure crisis, causing scores and scores of provisional ballots that ultimately did not and were not counted. Despite these obstacles, voters across the state came out in droves. I personally helped at many polling locations and witnessed people standing in lines for 6 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours, from 6 in the morning till 1 a.m. at night when they got out. And despite what was said earlier by an expert that said that that may have been a question of urban density, what I saw, what our colleagues saw throughout the state, that in fact there was a case of racial disparity in voting patterns. In Latino and Black and Haitian communities across the state, in the same areas, voting times were much longer than more affluent and white areas. In the city here in Miami, in the core of where the African American communities were at the North Dade Regional Library, lines were 5 to 10 times longer than in Miami Beach and other places. And that isn't a question of urban density, it's a question of racial disparity. And I say that both because of the problems it was, but also how proud we are here in Florida of how voters turned out. But despite their efforts to turn out and what they endured, there were many others who turned away. Cynthia Slater referenced a study that was done by Thomas Allen of Ohio State University for the Orlando Sentinel that showed that over 200,000 voters turned away because of those long lines and those rules. And they should not have to. The ones that were willing to come out made a sacrifice. The ones who turned away should not have to turn away for that reason. We are in the most advanced technological country in the world where voting should be simple and secure. The heat, the lines, the lack of facilities, lights, bathrooms, security, staffing, help, forced us to go on provisional ballots, has made Florida continue to be the Hurricane Katrina of elections. And unfortunately, I must say, and there's evidence to prove that the policies to restrict voter participation have been both partisan and racially targeted to impact electoral outcomes. It has been the case historically and has continued even into the past election cycle and beyond. As recently as the end of the last legislative session, 2 months ago, legislators in Florida were trying to restrict the volunteers who helped language assistants, seniors, and disabled. That was stymied here just 2 months ago because the Voting Rights Act and Section 4 would have made it an undoable burden to try and pursue. And what we see here in Florida is not unique, but is the reality that the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 has been such a critical protection because so many states, year after year, push new laws making it harder to vote. As the Advancement Project points out, this continues to happen because we have 13,000 different voting jurisdictions in this country that runs elections 13,000 different ways. Under this confusing patchwork system, the freedom to vote is left at the mercy of state officials. In Florida, that power has made voting rights a political football. In order to guarantee these travesties do not happen again, we believe that the need to improve the early voting processes, modernize the voting registration system, and protect voters against discrimination based on gender, race, age, income level, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, or disability. But more than anything, if the right to vote is fundamental to this democracy, then voting must be taken out of the shifting intentions of political operatives. It must be enshrined in the Constitution of our state and in the Constitution of the United States as a fundamental right. Towards this vision, among our specific recommendations are: enshrine the fundamental right to vote into law. Let's signal to the rest of the country that voting is not just a privilege for the few, but a fundamental value of the American experiment in democracy. Congress should now act to immediately expand and strengthen Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, and it's time to put the right to vote in the United States Constitution. We here in Florida know that we have to create a pathway to restore voting rights for persons convicted of a crime who've served their time. This is a reform that's supported by law enforcement because restoring voting rights gives people a stake in their communities and reduces the chance of recidivism. This effort here in Florida is championed by the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which we are a proud member. And there are 1.5 million returning citizens, ex-felons, who currently cannot vote. We must provide automatic voter registration for all individuals who are eligible to vote, provide a minimum set of early voting hours and days, provide supervisors of elections the flexibility to choose early voting locations consistent with the selection of sites on election day, and give them the resources that they need to improve the voting experience at the polls. And finally, I heard a term today that I didn't know before. It was called systemic manipulation. And in Florida, we've had systemic manipulation. We have to make state-based voter suppression a crime. Voter protection laws must be enhanced to include gender, income levels, and age, and improved to strictly criminalize deceptive practices in elections or by election administrators and the state legislature, and ensure that any violation of voting rights by the state or any institution is punishable under the full extent of the law. So thank you, especially after the events of this week in the Supreme Court and on the eve of immigration reform that promises to bring millions of deserving Americans to the doorsteps of citizenship. There's no better time to take these kind of bold and decisive actions to secure democracy. Thank you for holding this hearing today and listening to our perspectives. The right to vote is a fundamental and human and democratic right. We owe it to the past and future generations that we get it right this time through integrity and protection once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wish to address the commission? If not, we very much appreciate all your statements and input and the time you've taken to talk with us.
I just add my thanks to all.